I was flicking through Disney Plus the other day when I came across something I thought I might enjoy. Sorry, wrong clip. But it did star Thor, aka Chris Hemsworth.
Now, I may be in pretty decent shape. Sure, I may look like an immortal Norse god, etc. Stop it. I'm teaming up with the world's leading longevity experts.
Limitless with Chris Hemsworth.
Limitless is genuinely exciting. This is a big-budget, gorgeously filmed documentary series on a major streaming provider, directed with artistic flair by filmmaker Darren Aronofsky, on the subject of the biology of aging. And even better, it's made with the perspective that all of us should be doing everything we can to slow down the ticking of our biological clocks. An idea that I can obviously very much get behind. So I thought I'd take a look at some of the science behind the series. Chris does a succession of epic challenges themed around improving his health and fitness for the very long term. I'm going to concentrate on my 3 favourite episodes: fasting, memory, and acceptance. So let's start with what Chris described as the greatest challenge of the entire series.
I mean, I do know that what I put into my body is important, but what I didn't know is that the best thing I can eat if I want to live a long and healthy life is nothing. Absolutely nothing. For the next step in my quest to live longer and better, it's basically water and 0 calories for 4 days.
There is a lot to get into with the science of fasting. The work began in the 1930s, where scientists were studying rats to try to understand how different levels of calorie intake affected the lives and lifespans of animals. They took different groups of rats and fed them different amounts, but crucially made sure that their diets were optimised such that they were getting all of the nutrients they needed. So-called calorie restriction with optimal nutrition, or CRON. The results were absolutely incredible. The animals that were on the calorie-restricted diets lived almost half as long again as their counterparts who were allowed to eat what they liked. And this result has since been replicated across the animal kingdom, from single-celled yeast, through worms to flies, spiders, mice, rats obviously, dogs, guppies, trout, monkeys maybe. But obviously we are none of those animals, so what we care the most about are results in people. Unfortunately, it's really hard to do a lifelong calorie restriction experiment in humans for both practical and ethical reasons. So perhaps the best results we've got to go on are those from the so-called calorie study. See what they did there, where they got participants to live on a calorie-restricted diet and saw how that affected their health over the course of 2 years. Dietary restriction has effects throughout your body. It causes weight loss, which I guess you'd probably expect if you eat less. But it also improves general markers of health, like reducing blood pressure, improving cholesterol levels, and reducing levels of inflammation. But these results were seen during a 2-year study. We don't know what effect dietary restriction has on healthy lifespan overall. And it does come with side effects. Some are obvious, like feeling hungry, but it also poses risks such as reduced bone density, anemia, and maybe even a reduced immune response to infection. And there's no point having better cardiometabolic health if you just drop dead of the flu age 65. So we've got some evidence when it comes to continuous calorie restriction. But then when it comes to fasting, the evidence gets more complicated and, honestly, a little bit murky. The first problem is that there are a variety of different fasting regimens that are being proposed. Everything from the relatively easy end of the spectrum, something like time-restricted feeding, where you only eat during, say, a 6 or 8 hour window during the course of a 24-hour day, through something like intermittent fasting or the 5-2 diet, where you only eat for certain days a week or eat every other day, and perhaps you're allowed to eat a certain restricted number of calories on your fast days. All the way to the most extreme examples, the kind of long-term fast that Chris was doing during Limitless. Unfortunately, we just don't really know which of these might be the best intervention. Not only is there a lack of human data, it's really hard to compare the data that we collect from animals. Because, for example, how long is an equivalent fast between a human and a mouse? For a start, mice live for a far shorter period of time. Their lifespan is usually about 3 years, whereas obviously humans can make it to 80 or even 100 years old. So there's a huge discrepancy there. And then there's the speed of our metabolisms and the amount of food reserves that we have in our bodies. Humans can last a few weeks at most without food, but mice starve after just a few days. So how on earth do you calculate any kind of equivalence between those various numbers? So what's the best thing to do? Well, certainly you should try and eat a balanced diet and not be overweight, but I think it's really hard to say how fasting fits into all of that. All of that said, massive respect for Chris for managing to go 4 days without food. I'd be really quite grouchy after that period of time. In my opinion, the most important episode of the series, and certainly the bravest, is memory. And this is the most important clip.
Overall, your labs look fantastic. And I think looking at you from the outside, it's clear how much you take care of yourself. But we did find a couple of things that are a cause for concern.
Right.
Some of the genetic testing that we did looked at a gene for a protein called apo-e. You have a very rare combination, which is you have 2 copies of apo-e4, a set from your mom and a set from your dad.
And what does that mean exactly?
That means you have an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease.
How much higher?
Probably somewhere between 8 and 10 times higher than that of someone in the general population.
Yeah, right, okay. You know, you're, I don't know, you're constantly thinking you're going to live forever, especially as a young individual, and then to all of a sudden be told, oh, this may be the thing that might take you out, was like, whoa, kind of floored me for a minute.
The original idea when they were planning the series was that Chris would get all of his test results live on camera. But understandably, this one was considered sufficiently important that he was briefed beforehand. And he was actually given the option of removing it from the series entirely, because this is an incredibly personal genetic diagnosis. But massive props to Chris for leaving it in the show. I think this is really cool, because when famous people talk about these conditions, they make it easier for the rest of us to talk about them too. And Alzheimer's is a condition that affects millions of people around the world, and there are millions more of us walking around with a copy of apo-e4 in our DNA. This is a difficult idea that a lot of people are going to have to grapple with, and so it's amazing if Thor can use his platform to talk about that. You know, showing vulnerability in someone whose best known role on screen is playing an immortal Norse god. So thank you. The scientific question then is, what is apo-e and why is it important? If we look inside your body, we'll find that it's made up of cells. And inside those cells, there's a nucleus that contains DNA, the instruction manual for building you. A long string made up of chemicals which we assign the letters A, T, C, and G. These 1,000 letters are the apo-e gene, which contains the instructions for a protein that carries cholesterol around the body. This is the most common form of apo-e, known as apo-e3. But if we change just a single DNA letter, this one, from a T to a C, we can change this to apo-e4, the variant Chris has 2 copies of. Incredibly, this single letter genetic change is enough to massively increase his risk of Alzheimer's disease. The first question you might have is evolutionary. Why do we have apo-e4 if it's bad when apo-e3 and apo-e2 exist? Why haven't those variants outcompeted apo-e4 in our gene pool? And the answer is, well, it's complicated. We have to think back to tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago when human evolution was taking place. The fact is, most of us didn't live long enough to get dementia, and so there wasn't a huge evolutionary pressure to weed out this version of the gene. To make things more complicated still, genes very rarely have just a single function. This isn't just a gene that causes Alzheimer's disease. There's also some evidence that apo-e4 specifically is protective against parasitic infections, something that might have been a much bigger problem for our human ancestors living tens of thousands of years ago. There's even some evidence that apo-e4 protects against skin cancer. So this is a multifunctional gene, and its really bad effects aren't felt until very late in life, until an age that we've only been living to in relatively recent times. The other thing that's worth saying is that apo-e4 isn't a death sentence. It's what's called a risk factor. That means it does increase your risk of Alzheimer's, in the case of when you've got 2 copies, by quite a significant amount, but it's not a guarantee that you're going to develop the disease. The problem with taking a genetic test now to determine your apo-e status is there's just not very much we can do. Even if you have the highest risk form, E4E4, then the advice is going to be basically the same as general health advice. It's going to be eat well, don't be overweight, get plenty of exercise, make sure you get plenty of sleep, and so on. And although that diagnosis might provide encouragement to stick to your diet plan or make sure you go to bed on time, ultimately it's no different to advice that you give to absolutely anybody else trying to improve their health. However, there is some exciting news, and that's that apo-e is a strong contender for gene therapy, specifically a type of therapy called base editing. You might have heard of CRISPR, which is where an incredibly precise pair of molecular scissors can be targeted to a particular region of DNA, and they can go in and snip that DNA at that precise location. Base editing uses a very similar protein, but instead of snipping at that site, it can swap one base for another, change one genetic letter for another one, as it were. What that means is that we could use this base editing technology to go in and switch an apo-e4 into a much less dangerous apo-e3 version of the gene. And most excitingly, this is something that's already been demonstrated, at least in cells in a dish. When base editing was first announced in a paper in 2016, apo-e was one of the examples they used to demonstrate that the technology works. Even more excitingly, base editing is rapidly making its way to the clinic. In late 2022, the first story hit the news. A young girl with leukemia where base editing was used to modify some immune cells and seemingly clear out her cancer. That's an incredibly exciting result in its own right, but it also shows we're taking steps toward using this not just in cells in a dish, but in actual human beings. So maybe editing apo-e might not be that far into the future. The final episode was easily the most moving.
All I've been told is that I'm about to jump forward 50 years into the future and spend the next 3 days living the life of an octogenarian.
Chris is about to take part in a truly unique experiment.
Ready, my old man?
I don't know. I mean, ask me in 3 days' time, maybe.
And then at the end of 3 days at Sunset Pines, we are going to kill Chris Hemsworth.
Sticking Chris into a fake retirement home for 3 days could easily have been mawkish and sentimental. But it wasn't. It was actually quite beautiful. There were these wonderful little touches like a fake autobiography lying on his bedside table in the room that he stayed in, and a wonderful reunion that I won't spoil. And I just think it was a fantastic way to bring home the realities of aging to a younger audience who might not ever have been exposed to it. Watching Chris trying to come to terms with his own aging, with the impaired mobility, hearing and sight brought about by him wearing this slightly ridiculous old age suit, they all just show us what it's actually like to become old. And this is something that our society does an incredibly good job of shielding us from.
Oh, good shot.
It's very easy to go through the whole first part of your adult life without ever really having to engage with the reality of the aging process. The disability, the frailty, the diseases, the dementia, because as a society, we tend to hide old people away, whether it be in residential homes or in hospitals, so it's pretty easy to miss unless you're directly responsible for someone's care. And I think the most striking statistic in this respect is that the average age of somebody caring for someone else who's over the age of 65 is 63. So what that means is that young adults largely aren't caring for their parents or other older people, so they never see aging in others, and obviously they're not aging themselves, so they just never have to engage with it. This episode is called Acceptance, and although I think it is pretty important to have some acceptance of aging on an individual level, after all, it is happening to all of us, on a societal level, I don't think we should go gentle into that good night. And the reason is research into aging biology. I've already talked about how gene therapy might be able to reduce the risk for people with the highest risk variants of apo-e, but this is far from the only game in town. Aging biology is uncovering the mechanisms that cause us all to age and allowing us to understand not just how to reduce the risk of individual diseases, but how to slow down the aging process as a whole. The aging process that's responsible not just for dementia, but for cancer, for heart disease, for stroke, for frailty, for all of the leading killers and disability causes in the modern world. Take fasting. We don't know whether it's fasting or calorie restriction, and if so, which particular fasting regimen or type of calorie restriction that's going to get the greatest benefit for your health. But by understanding the biology of aging, we can look at the processes that are happening inside your cells as you fast and try and identify the beneficial ones and create drugs that can mimic that process without you having to feel hungry all the time. A really good example of this is a drug called rapamycin, which is one of the most consistent healthy life-extending drugs that we've ever tried. It works in mice, whether you start it when they're young, whether you start it when they're old, in a whole load of different conditions, and it makes them live longer and healthier in almost every experiment we've done. With more attention and funding for aging biology, we could start doing experiments in people to find out if those same beneficial effects apply. Limitless also talks about zombie cells. It's another name for senescent cells, basically aged cells that accumulate in all of our bodies as we get older, and they're known to drive a whole range of age-related problems. And the good news is that aging biology is delivering drugs, called senolytic drugs, that can go in and kill these cells selectively, and when we tried it in mice, they basically make those mice biologically younger. And this isn't just something for mice in the lab. There are already 20 or 30 companies trying to commercialise senolytics, to turn these from an idea that works on the lab bench to something that works in actual human patients with diseases in the clinic. And this means that aging biology is coming incredibly soon to a clinic or a hospital near you. If I had the profile of Chris Hemsworth and the budget of Limitless, then this is the story that I'd tell. If you want to live a long, healthy, happy life, the best thing you can do isn't fasting or sauna. It's to raise the profile of aging biology. It might sound like quite a counterintuitive piece of health advice, but I genuinely believe it's the most important thing you can do, not just for yourself, but for your friends, your family, and for billions of people you don't know. Because this is an incredible field of science with enormous potential to revolutionise the way we do medicine, to come up with preventative treatments for many, maybe even all of the diseases of old age, perhaps even cure the aging process itself. And far too few people know about it. If you haven't quite got the profile of a Marvel superhero, I've stuck a link in the description with ways that you can advocate for aging biology and some charities to donate to. But Chris, Darren, if you're watching, why not make this incredible science the subject of a new documentary? There are just as many gorgeous locations and incredible characters with which you can tell this story. And it is the most exciting science of our time. An area of science that has the genuine potential to bring human beings closer to actually being limitless.